Good evening, everyone. I am Rabbi Levi Darby, and I serve as Director of Jewish Life at the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. It's my pleasure this evening to welcome you to the third and final session of Grappling with Race in America. In this session, we'll explore how discrimination and inequity manifest in California's educational system, and what impact this has on the lives of Black people, people of color, and other disenfranchised communities. This program is presented by the Peninsula Jewish Community Center and the North Peninsula Jewish Community, designed to enable our community to grapple with the realities of racism and injustice, and to engage in open and honest conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our own community. I'm immensely grateful to the rabbis of our congregation for their collegiality and partnership in creating this program. I also want to express our community's thanks to the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, whose generous funding made this program possible. This series is being presented in conjunction with the Jewish Community Relations Council, whose mission is to educate and advocate on issues of vital importance to the organized Jewish community, based on consensus, civility, and an expanded commitment to living Jewish values of social justice. I want especially to thank Jessica Trubowich, Public Policy and Community Building Director of the JCRC, whose guidance and support in planning this series has been invaluable. This evening's program, as the other programs have been, structured as a webinar, so only the speakers will be visible and only the speakers will be heard. We do hope you will actively participate in the program by putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And our speaker will answer as many of your questions as time permits. Please be aware that we are recording this presentation and that the recording will be available at the PJCC website, pjcc.org, and it will be available by early next week. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ms. Natalie Wheatfall-Lum. Natalie Wheatfall-Lum joined the Education Trust West in 2014, where she supported the organization's policy research, analysis, and position development, primarily in the areas of K-12, equitable funding, and accountability. Ms. Wheatfall-Lum's work is grounded in understanding the experiences of those stakeholders directly impacted by education policy decisions: parents, students, and community advocates. Prior to her current position, Ms. Wheatfall-Lum was an Education Pioneers Graduate Fellow with Ed Trust West. And before her work in education policy, Ms. Wheatfall-Lum practiced law, gaining experience in various civil rights issue areas, including LGBTQ equal rights, fair housing, and immigration. She earned her JD from Howard University School of Law, and while in law school, Ms. Wheatfall-Lum worked as a student attorney in Howard University's Civil Rights Clinic, representing clients in employment, housing, and education discrimination cases. Ms. Wheatfall-Lum, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Levi. I'm really excited to be here, and I very much appreciate the invitation. And I'm happy to share with you all some background information on the state of education equity in California. And I will go ahead and begin sharing my screen. I think I need permissions for screen share.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
I think that should do it. Currently, you're muted, Natalie.
Thank you, Levi. Okay, can everyone hear me and see my screen? I'm going to go into presentation mode.
We can.
Okay, can you all see the full screen slides? Yes? Okay.
Yes, we can see.
Great, thank you. So I'm happy to be here with you all today to speak a little bit about the state of education equity in California. And to get started, one thing that we like to do at EdTrust West is to center our work on the experiences that we've had in our education systems in California and our experiences as our whole selves in the work that we do. And so I want to share a little bit about myself. Oh, so do you see the presentation view or the notes view?
We see the notes view. So it shows next slide and notes. It's not a full screen.
Oh, okay. Let me X out of this view to see if I can switch it over. Let me stop my share and see if I can fix. Okay, can you see the full screen now?
Yes, this looks
Yes.
Okay, great, perfect. So as I was saying, we at EdTrust West, we center our whole selves and how we come to the work given our life experiences along with our professional experiences. So in introducing myself, I would like to share the reasons why I've entered this area of work. I am born and raised in California, and I'm a product of many of California's public education systems. I attended K-12 schools in California. I attended school in the community college system here and in the University of California system as a graduate of UC San Diego. So in navigating those systems, I learned from my own experiences of the disparities that exist in the system. When I was in K-12 schools, I transferred when I was in middle school from a district that was predominantly students of color and with a large number of teachers of color, but it was in a working class, low income area. And so there were few financial resources at our disposal. And I changed schools to a district that was in a more affluent area where I was one of few students of color. And as I navigated that change, I gained access to resources like the Gifted and Talented Education Program at my new district. So I tested into that program, but my schools didn't have the resources up until that point to hold those programs. So on my first day meeting my new GATE teacher, she said, "Hi, I'm Mrs. Bungard. This is the GATE class or the gifted class. Are you sure you're in the right place?" And so that was my first interaction with this new school. And it was the first of many interactions I had with adults where my academic abilities were questioned and I was discouraged from pursuing advanced coursework where I had excelled beforehand and I continued to, but every time I opted into an honors course or an AP course, I got questions from my counselors around whether or not it would be too much of a challenge for me or if I was able to handle the classes, even though I had an A/B average in those courses. And so that made me wonder, along with the fact that I was the only Black student in all these courses, what forces were at play to set up that dynamic that I experienced. And that led me to asking a lot of questions about fairness and justice in the education system. and led me to pursue ethnic studies in undergrad, and then go on to pursue a career in civil rights as an attorney. And finally, through my career trajectory, I came back to looking at education policy as a significant lever in creating the types of changes in fairness and justice in the system to alleviate the types of experiences I had as a student, and so that students after me don't have to experience those same types of dynamics in their schools. So that's kind of a little bit about why I engage in the work that I engage in. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about our organization. Education Trust West is a nonprofit education equity organization focused on educational justice and closing achievement and opportunity gaps through research, data, policy analysis, and advocacy. Our work centers around identifying inequities in our education system, and through research, finding solutions to those inequities, and through our policy advocacy, finding solutions to forever shift those inequities, and in so doing, shifting the level of justice in our education system. So the ways that we do this are through research, publishing reports and briefs. It's through working with various stakeholders from the community-based organization level to the state level, finding partnerships and working with and on behalf of students that are directly impacted by these policies, and leveraging the experiences they have and uplifting those to policymakers at all levels, whether that be at the school district, regional, or state level, working with our legislature and our governor's office. So before I get started and start diving into the structures of equity and inequity in our system, I like to ask the question, what does equity mean to you? I found that in this work that a lot of people have different ideas of what equity means. So I just want to give a couple of minutes for folks to just reflect on the meaning of equity, and then I can share what definition we use in our work.
And people can put their ideas in the chat if you like, if you wish to share them with others.
So someone added fairness. I think that is a meaningful definition of equity. Equity is a treatment in all aspects of life that is the same for all. Equal access with comparable teachers and resources, giving people what they need to succeed. All of these are resonating with the work that we do at Ed Trust West. And expectations, definitely. Yeah, this all aligns with the definition that we use in relationship to equity. The way we define equity is recognizing the historical and systemic disparities in opportunities and outcomes that disparately impact different groups of students in this case, and also providing the resources that are necessary to address those disparities, and in so doing, ultimately dismantling systemic barriers. So we use this definition as our guiding principle in our work, and in our work we seek to identify the barriers, the structures in our system that create disparate opportunities for students, and then think through solutions to pull down those barriers so that we have a more equitable and fair system. So before I get started in walking us through sort of how these structures and barriers came to be, I like to turn back to this quote from one of my personal heroes, Ella Baker, one of the leaders of the civil rights movement, and a woman who spent a lot of the time engaging in the civil rights movement, supporting students that were part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, staging sit-ins and peaceful demonstrations. And so what she said was, in order to see where we are going, we not only must remember where we have been, but we must also understand where we have been. And I think that this is huge because we need to be able to see clearly how these structures of inequity came to be, because that insight and that knowledge is going to help us identify the solutions to break down those structures. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of education policy in California and how over the course of our state's history, these disparate structures came to be. So there are some really early actions from the state government in California, right at the time where California was becoming a state, that set up very clear inequities in our systems. And these are inequities that we are, grappling with to this day. And the first being in 1852, California established its fugitive slave law. And this was 2 years after statehood. And while California was a free state, they established laws through which slaves who were deemed to be fugitive slaves would be returned to their owners. And part of this package of laws created a barrier for Black students from receiving schooling. So even though Black youth in California were free during the time of slavery, they were not allowed to even receive education in any way. So that is a stark reminder that we are working from such a deficit in terms of getting to a state of equality, such that there was a time at which in our state, Black students were not even deemed to be worthy of being educated. So from that point on, we have another policy that established segregation for the first time in the state of California, in that schools that educated students who were non-white did not receive state funding. And this didn't just impact Black students, but at this time in California's history, there were a number of former Mexican citizens who were youth in the school system, and also a number of Chinese youth who both did not have access to equal education and were segregated from their white peers. This policy of segregation was further codified through the court case Ward v. Flood, which was a court case that preceded the national case Plessy versus Ferguson, that first established a separate but equal doctrine in California, thus solidifying segregated schools in the state. So this set up an initial early dynamic of Jim Crow-like conditions in the state of California. I think that we have this mythology about the state of California that we're sort of a progressive haven and that we are ahead of the curve when it comes to issues of racial justice. However, we were in the same position as states in the Jim Crow South post-slavery when it came to separate but equal policies in our state. So in reaction to this set of Jim Crow-like policies, there was a pendulum swing toward justice that came in the late 40s. And that began particularly in the education system with the court case Mendez v. Westminster School District. And the plaintiff of this case was a young woman who was named Sylvia Mendez, and she's a Mexican-American youth who challenged this state segregation policy in schools. So she and her family wanted her to attend a school that was predominantly white, and they were barred from entry into the school. And so they filed a court case in state court, and this case from the Supreme Court of California dismantled separate but equal for schools in California and set a really strong precedent for the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. And then subsequent to Brown v. Board, we have the National Civil Rights Act that implemented anti-discriminatory laws across various areas of American life, including access to public accommodations, employment discrimination, and one of those areas was education. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 guaranteed anti-discrimination for students based on race, national origin, religious affiliation, and nationality for all students, and is still being enforced to this day by the Federal Department of Education. And then finally, one of these strings of civil rights era cases was the case in 1974, Low V Nichols, and this was a court case that was the subject of which was the San Francisco Unified School District policy of educating students solely in English without any curriculum that allowed English learners to attain proficiency in the English language. The plaintiff of this case was a Chinese youth whose family challenged the fact that they weren't receiving, their son was not receiving instruction in their native language, which is Chinese, and they also were not receiving any instruction to gain proficiency to English. So this established the right of English learners to either be educated in their own language so that they could access a standard curriculum, or the option of curriculum that helped students develop English proficiency so they could access curriculum. So these were benchmark cases for equity in California's system and set us up for working towards a more equitable experience for students of color, low-income students, and students learning English in California. But as we see in other areas of policy and other areas of American life, this pendulum of justice swings backward and forward. So there was blowback from these initial cases that established broader rights for students of color in California. And these are just three examples of issue areas where we saw this take place. The first being affirmative action. In 1978, there was a Supreme Court case called UC Regents versus Bakke, in which the University of California's affirmative action policies were challenged by a student. And the Supreme Court held that affirmative action was allowable, was constitutional, but they dialed back the use of racial quotas in admissions decisions. However, subsequent to this upholding of affirmative action by the Supreme Court, California had a ballot measure in 1995 called Proposition 209, which thus banned the use of affirmative action or the use of looking at the racial background of both employment candidates and also admissions candidates into our public school systems. And so they are now our current UC and CSU admission systems are not able to consider race as one of several factors taken into account in admissions decisions. And folks may remember that on the 2020 ballot, there was a proposition called Prop 16 that was focused on reversing this ban on affirmative action that was implemented by Prop 209, but it ended up not passing on our ballot in 2020. So another area of education policy that has seen this pendulum swing has been school integration, which has had significant implications on access to educational opportunities. So I think many folks are familiar with the 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education, that deemed separate but equal as unconstitutional and catalyzed the school integration push across the country. One resulting circumstance from that was this phenomenon called white flight, in which white families moved away from school districts that were integrating, opting for regions and areas that were more homogeneously white, and so thus avoiding integration. And this phenomenon was challenged by the 1974 Supreme Court case called Milliken v. Bradley, which was focusing on the ability to integrate between districts. So if there was a district that was predominantly white that bordered a district that was predominantly students of color, there would be this, the hope was that there would be a requirement that those districts integrate across district boundary lines. However, the Supreme Court upheld that school integration only applied within districts. And so that set off a pattern of resegregation that we see from the late 70s until today. And we see also that our schools in California specifically are more segregated than they were subsequent to the Brown v. Board decision. So we saw this era of integration and then resegregation. So we're at a point of segregation that we saw in the 50s, essentially. And then finally, in school funding, we saw some gains through the 1971 court decision, Serrano v. Priest. And this court case challenged California's traditional school funding system, which was based on local property tax revenues. So whatever property tax revenue a district received locally, they used locally, which set up an unfair access to resources because districts that were in lower property value areas, which tended to be higher poverty areas, received less funding than their counterparts in more affluent areas. So this court case challenged that funding system, and the California Supreme Court ruled that this was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause for the state of California, and that all schools had to be funded at equal levels. So from that point on, property taxes were rolled up to the state and then allocated equally across districts. This move towards more equal funding received some backlash because folks in high wealth areas didn't want their property tax dollars going outside of their local areas. And so that mentality influenced the passage of Proposition 13, which was a capping of property market values for the purposes of assessing property taxes at the property value at which properties were purchased. And this, in a lot of cases, is a good thing because it means that folks who buy a house and over the course of 30 years, the property tax amount might become unaffordable if income doesn't align with the increase in property value. However, this policy applies not only to residential property, but it also applies to commercial property. And California holds some of the highest value commercial property in the country, if not in the world, given the size of corporations that operate in California. Chevron, Disneyland, Shell are some of the largest corporate property holders in the country. And California schools are losing out on the property tax value that could be coming from those properties as well. So similar to this dynamic with school funding, there are a number of impacts of these policies that have trickled down over the course of the last several decades on fairness and equity in our education system. And to just illustrate further the impact of Prop 13, we see here that this chart shows the assessed value of just commercial properties in California, just properties held by companies and corporations versus the market value of those properties. So you can see that we are far from keeping pace with what the property tax revenue could be in our state. As you can see here, California has lost approximately $585 billion from property tax revenue just from commercial property had Prop 13 not gone into effect related to commercially held property. And folks might also remember there was a ballot measure that challenged this dynamic on our ballot in 2020, also Prop 15, which would have exempted commercial property holders from the market value hold that applies to all property taxes. So why is this an equity issue? As you can see here, one resulting impact of Prop 13 is that our per pupil spending in California has gone down significantly in rank since Prop 13 passed. In the 1960s, we were one of the highest states in terms of per pupil funding for our public schools. But you can see here, I think this was as recent as 2019, we now rank 38th in per pupil funding because we're not bringing in the same level of revenue in relationship to the amount of students that we serve in our state. And this has this and other decisions have had ongoing impacts on the level of fairness that we see in our system. I just want to walk folks through this chart because it's a lot of information. What this chart shows is the percentage of high school graduates that meet what are called A through G requirements. And these are the requirements that make students eligible for applying to the UC system and the California State University system. So this isn't even competitiveness in those systems. This is just the floor of being eligible to apply. And you can see here that in California, overall, on average, 50% of graduating seniors meet these requirements. But then you can see if we look group by group, there are varying degrees of groups being able to reach or exceed this state average. You can see here that Black students, Latinx students, Native American students, and low-income students all are not meeting the state average for completing these course requirements for eligibility, where other groups of students are vastly exceeding these state averages. And this is just one example of how disparate supports, disparate funding have disparate impacts on the education opportunities that students experience. And I just want to note here too, that we see really high numbers for Filipino students and Asian students, but this can be somewhat misleading because the Asian student population in California is very diverse and broad and have varying degrees of access to resources. So this broad group includes students that may have more privileges and that don't, but because we don't have access to data breaking down this group into subgroups that represent students from Southeast Asian nationalities and other Asian groups that don't have the same levels of access to opportunities, we can't see the disparities that exist within that group. And then I see a question here. Are A through G requirements not offered at these schools, or are students not encouraged to take them? And that is an issue that is like a school by school issue. I'll talk a little bit later about how districts have sought to address this issue through their policies, but it can be any number of things. It can be that schools don't offer the full sequence, or students do attend schools that offer the full sequence of courses but are discouraged from taking those courses. And we see from this disparate access to these benchmark courses to access our public education systems have an impact on admission and enrollment into those systems. This chart shows that the relationship between the representation of both Black and Latinx students in the 12th grade graduating classes and the corresponding freshman enrollment in the UC system. So you can see here that Black students, both in 1998, 99, and 20 years later, are underrepresented in the UC system in comparison to their representation in the 12th grade class corresponding. And these gaps have shrunk over time, which is encouraging, but we still don't see parity between 12th graders and then the next year of freshmen. And unfortunately, these gaps have widened when it comes to Latinx students. As you can see, Latinx students are the majority of the 12th grade graduating class in 2019, but only 25% of the freshmen in across the UC system in the corresponding year. We also see the impact of the ban on affirmative action in admission rates to the UC. And this goes back to Proposition 209, which alleviated the use of taking race into account in admissions decisions. And you can see that before Prop 209 passed in 1994, the admissions rate, so the rate of students who gained acceptance who applied to the UCs, was at 75% for Black students and 82% for Latinx students. And for Latinx students, that rate was higher than the average across California. But over time, we see those admissions rates just decrease because the fact that students of color have less access to opportunities that make them competitive candidates for the UCs is not taken into account in admissions decisions. We also see the impact of the ban on affirmative action in teacher diversity and retention. And over many, many research studies, it's been shown that having teachers that reflect the diversity of our student body is positive for student outcomes, not only for students of color, but for all students. And this kind of grouping of statistics show that there's a significant disparity between California's K through 12 teacher workforce and the diversity that we see in our student body. And in order to close the gap in that diversity, we don't have at our disposal in the state of California the ability to take race into account as we are recruiting and retaining teachers in our teacher workforce. So this all begs the question, why is this? Why has this happened? And I walked through some policies and court cases that have gotten us to this point, but that still doesn't answer the question of why those decisions were made. And I think one stark example of how to illustrate these decisions is looking at the choices our state and systems make over time. So one example is that since 1980, California has built 22 prisons and 4 public universities. And when I learned of this reality, it was a stark illustration of the fact that in California, based on the decisions that our leaders make, it shows us that our values around incarcerating people are at a higher priority than us educating our students in California. So that's one example. And just for background, the 4 universities that have been built since 1980 are UC Merced, CSU Channel Islands, CSU Monterey Bay, and CSU San Marcos. These are examples of some other decisions that system leaders make that result in disparate opportunities for students. One of them being that only 65% of English classes are A through G approved in high schools in high poverty areas, compared to 76% of classes in affluent areas, meaning there are 11% more English classes that prepare students to be eligible for the UCs in affluent areas than there are in higher poverty areas. We also see a similar phenomenon when it comes to staffing in our schools. Students in more affluent high schools are 2 times more likely to have access to a librarian than schools in high poverty areas. And this is a stark statistic because students in higher poverty areas need additional supports to unlock educational opportunities. However, the dynamic is that affluent students are receiving those additional supports who are in less need of them. I feel like this quote from sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva is a really interesting explanation for how we see these policies play out. He says, colorblind racism is the new racial music most people dance to. The new racism is subtle, institutionalized, and seemingly non-racial. So what happens, I think, now, unlike when we saw blatant segregation laws in early California, is that these dynamics become more complicated and the focus is less on what is needed for the most marginalized students, rather than the focus being on the students that have the most agency and privilege. And that is something that happens subtly and happens over time and is compounded over time. And while we see these dynamics at play, we're still seeing progress being made. I think that there's been a shift in the values of our state and what we prioritize. And some policy wins that we've seen recently have started to swing those pendulum back towards a more equitable system. And my hope is that this swing continues. We see this in a few different areas of policy and education. One is both the local control funding formula for K through 12 schools and the student success funding formula in the California community colleges. These formulas are a response to the inequitable access to resources that we see as a result of Prop 13. Both of these policies allow for districts and schools and community colleges campuses that serve higher numbers of high need students. It allows them to receive additional funding beyond the base level of funding for schools and colleges. So if a K-12 school has a high number of English learners or high number of low-income students, they receive additional funding to serve the unique needs of those students. And similarly in the community colleges, for students who receive federal financial aid funding, or students who are the first generation of college goers in their family, college campuses receive additional funding to serve those specific students. We also see this in the English Learner Roadmap. So the English Learner Roadmap is a policy that was adopted by the California Department of Education that is meant to shift the ideas and visions around how to serve English learners. Up until this point, there's been really a deficit framing for the servicing of English learner needs. They're seen as being behind. They're seen as not being able to access a full curriculum. This vision shifts the mentality of the system to identify the unique value that English learners bring to our education system. We're embarking on a more global society where students need to have global mindsets, need to be better exposed to foreign languages. So this shift in vision takes into account the assets that English learners bring to our system, and sets up an ideology of serving the needs of these students so we can unlock the value that they have for all of us to learn from them. We also have in California a developing data system called the Cradle to Career Data System. And this is a huge, but albeit wonky, policy step forward. The California is in the process of developing a data system that incorporates data from early childhood all the way to the workforce, so that we can see the youth of California through the full education pipeline. And this will allow us to see where there are strengths and pitfalls along this continuum, so we can better identify where youth and students need more supports along the way. Having access to this information is huge because it'll allow us to better identify inequities and demand educational justice. So when I see these types of policies being passed and championed by California leaders, it brings a lot of hope for us to get to a place of better educational justice. We also see this happening at a local level, and there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from things that folks are doing at a district and campus level. So I'd like to provide some of those examples for you also. The first of these is the the Chula Vista Elementary School District. So this is a school district that serves students from kindergarten to 6th grade. And this is a district that sits right at the US-Mexico border in San Diego County. And I am proud to say that I am a product of this district. I went to elementary school in this district. And there are some really valuable practices happening specifically as it relates to English learners. As I mentioned with the roadmap, there's been a shift in mentality around English learners, and there's been a proliferation of dual immersion programs, and many of which are happening in Chula Vista's district. Dual immersion programs allow native Spanish speakers and native English speakers to learn together and learn both English and Spanish. So it highlights the asset of English learners, as well as having the benefit of English learners being exposed to students who are native English speakers learning Spanish. And this has been a very successful program, and we see huge gains for students in our English language arts assessments. So dual immersion students are outperforming non-dual immersion students by 5 percentage points, and English learners in dual enrollment programs are outperforming non-dual immersion students by 11 percentage points. And the reason why this has been so successful is that teachers are using research-based practices, in this case, a practice called guided language and acquisition design. And these research-based practices center the needs of students learning English so that they have the best access to a full curriculum and teaching and learning. So this has been a great model for us to replicate across the state. We also see some promising practices in Whittier Union High School District. This is a district in LA County that has a high number of Latino students. And similar to what I mentioned about A through G, the A through G course sequence being disparately available to students, this district has taken it upon itself to ensure that A through G is the default curriculum and that all students from 9th to 12th grade are automatically opted in to taking A through G courses. And this has resulted in Whittier Union High School District having higher than average A through G completion outcomes than what we see overall in the state. And for Latino students in Whittier, they are completing A through G courses at 15 percentage points higher than Latino students statewide. Finally, we have an example from Pasadena City College, which is a community college in LA County also. And they have a pathways program, which is structured around the specific needs of traditionally marginalized and underrepresented students in higher education. So these pathway programs provide scaffolded supports like tutoring, peer learning networks, extra counseling supports to make sure that students don't get stuck in a cycle of non-credit bearing courses that are not leading to transfer or to a degree. And so this process and pathways fast track students directly to college level courses at the junior college. And they've seen a significant amount of success in having students transfer to the Cal State system and complete 2-year degrees. So that concludes what I am sharing with you all today. I'm happy to share with you and also happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Natalie, thank you so very much for your presentation. Greatly appreciated. There are a couple of questions in the Q&A box, and for members of the audience, we do invite you to put questions in the Q&A box, and I will be happy to pass them on to Ms. Wheatfall-Lum for her consideration. The first question has to do with things that have happened in education with our colleges system after, because of COVID. Admissions to California colleges this year excluded the use of high stakes exams due to COVID. These tests excluded many students of color. Do you perceive this as a positive move? And do you think it will continue even after COVID?
This is a great question, and it's definitely a timely one. Yes, we do see some positive indications from the exclusion of the use of high stakes exams like the ACT and SAT for college admissions. There was a significant increase in applications from Black and Latinx students in this last cycle. I think we've yet to see the numbers on admissions because I think those decisions are still being made and they're still being rolled out, but it's looking encouraging. And what's even more encouraging is that the UC system has independently made the decision to eliminate the use of the SAT altogether. Not just given our current circumstances with the pandemic, and this is a decision they've made to go beyond the pandemic, because it's been proven in research over and over again that the SAT is not a reliable indicator of student success in college. A much more reliable indicator is a student's GPA. So they're taking that data and that research and applying it to their policies to be more inclusive. They are considering developing their own assessment independent of the SAT. So it's yet to be determined whether or not that assessment is going to be more inclusive and equitable, but they've been really open with equity advocates like ourselves in the process of developing that assessment. So there's still more to come on that, but I think at least for the next 1 or 2 admission cycles, there won't be any SAT exam required for the UC system, which is a step in the right direction in our view.
The examples that you shared about successful programs just a few minutes ago was really kind of fascinating and struck me and others as well. Is there a reason, do you think, that more schools don't follow the lead of successful schools in this regard, or successful policies?
Yes, there's myriad reasons why schools don't follow the lead. I think a lot of the reasons that we see is just a lack of the capacity to make these shifts. There should be structures in place to support our education leaders at the school and district level with the information and supports that they need to make these types of changes. We as an organization provide these types of support with one of our teams, our educator engagement team, does what we call an education equity audit with school districts to identify policies and practices in districts that lead to disparate opportunities. So leaders need those types of supports to make those changes. Sometimes though, a lot of leaders just get stuck in a cycle of the status quo, and that status quo is not challenged. And so there's no extrinsic motivation to make any changes. And that is something that we're also working on. We want to, in our work, uncover these types of inequities to motivate folks to make these changes that are needed to implement more fairness in our system.
Earlier, when you're showing graphs of success rates or even admissions into UCs, it seemed to me, if I understood correctly, that people who are lower on the economic scale or are not as economically privileged as some experience similar difficulties to African Americans and people of color. Their rates are almost the same at the low end.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it the case that this goes beyond simply an issue of race or racial discrimination, and that there's also an economic problem here?
I think it's a both and. I think there's a combination and an intersection between race and income that's at play here. I wish I had, there's another graph that we have that identifies student math and English outcomes by both race and poverty level. And you can see on that graph that higher income Latinx and Black students actually fare worse than low income white and Asian students. So that shows us that it's beyond just a race or an income issue. It's a race and an income issue, in my view. And what is probably not apparent in that low income group of students is that group of low income students is probably predominantly students of color in the state of California. What we know from demographic and census data is that the bulk of folks in our state living in poverty are people of color. So there's a little bit of an overlap there as well.
Thank you. And it seems pretty obvious that Californians are recalcitrant to raise taxes, property taxes, in order to fund schools. Do you have a thought as to what correctives are available to change this situation? Is there anything that is available?
That's a really excellent question. One area that we've been successful in raising revenue is on capital income. Prop 30, I believe back in 2014, Prop 30 passed, which was an increase in tax on our highest income earners and on capital gains. So that actually increased California's revenue and school funding significantly. And folks probably remember the Great Recession, 2008 on. Prop 30 brought us out of that Great Recession in California and increased funding for schools. So that has been an effective means of increasing revenue. Unfortunately, it's a very volatile funding source because it's heavily dependent on financial markets and the stock market. And so if the stock market dips, our revenue dips significantly. I think that it's worth continuing to chip away at Prop 13 and this issue of commercial property tax not being taxed at its market value. We came very close to passing Prop 15 in 2020. Unfortunately, it didn't pass, but I think that that's not a reason to not continue to work at challenging these unfair systems of revenue, like these corporations in California that benefit so much from the talent and resources in our state should also be paying their fair share, in my opinion. So I think that it's really important to not stop challenging those dynamics, even if we came on a stumbling block in 2020 with it.
Are there any groups that are actually doing grassroots work with different communities in California to get them to understand the importance of these taxes to funding our schools? I mean, 38 in the country is embarrassing.
Yeah, agreed. There was the Schools and Communities First campaign that did a lot of grassroots organizing in relationship to Prop 15 to highlight this huge underfunding of our schools. And it was not just underfunding of schools, but also underfunding of public services like municipalities and the services they provide. I can provide some links to the organizations doing that work, but there's a huge kind of coalition of groups across the state that have been doing grassroots organizing on this issue for years and years.
Great. I think it would be interesting to have that list. I would be happy to also send it around to the community for people who might be interested in seeing it. There's a member of the audience who is asking about the impact of busing in the 1970s in California. Given hindsight, what we know now, how would you describe the impact of busing?
I think that the impact was positive at first. There are studies that show increased outcomes for Black students and students of color around the 70s and 80s when integration was sort of in full swing. I think the phenomenon is that as students with disparate opportunities are in the same conditions, the advocacy that happens on the part of more privileged students actually ends up benefiting less privileged students in those environments. However, there was a phenomenon also of tracking students within the same school. So you would have all the Black students in remedial classes in the same school as white students taking accelerated classes. So I think that the outcomes were mixed in a lot of ways. I think busing and integration as a policy solution was not a sustainable one. I think we see that in the fact that we've gotten back to the same levels of segregation we saw right after the passage of Brown v. Board. I think what we need to do is, and one thing that we're seeking to do is thinking about the students that we are currently serving in California's system. The way the system operates is in a way that served students well when students were doing well in the 60s and 70s, but our demographics have shifted considerably and the needs of students have shifted considerably, and our system hasn't kept up with that. So as we continue to find the ways that the California system is falling short for students, we can make those changes and catch the system up to the needs of the students that we're serving now.
So here's another question about school funding. The questioner asks, is school funding still related to attendance? Is this equitable in your opinion?
Yes, so school funding is still related to levels of attendance. And there has been a decline in attendance over time. And this somewhat relates to charter schools, it somewhat relates to parents making the decision to have their students attend private schools. And it can also relate to like just a decline in population too. So is the funding based on attendance and equitable? I don't necessarily think so. I think the focus should just be on creating funding structures that get the resources to the students that are most in need of those resources in a reliable way, and ensures transparency and accountability around the spending of those dollars in ways that best support the highest need students.
One of our questioners asks again about COVID, saying COVID has amplified the inequities for Blacks and low-income students. How should this be addressed? What do you think are the best ways to address these inequities?
That's a great question, and it's a question that we've been grappling a lot with as students are returning to school, and as we see case counts going down, and the possibility of students going back to school in large numbers is becoming more and more real. I think that one thing that we're considering is that COVID has uncovered a lot of the inequities that existed in our system and amplified them, but they've always been there. And we're hoping that with this additional focus on meeting the needs of students resulting from COVID, it will encourage leaders to meet the needs of students that have always been there. And in doing this, most effectively, we've found is that building relationships with families and students to both increase the trust that exists between students and schools, and also to best assess what student needs are, might be one of the highest leverage ways to meet those needs. Schools can't meet needs that they're not aware of. And and in order to be aware of those needs, there needs to be a building of relationships between schools and students and families. So that's one area that we think is really important to focus on right now. We also think that there needs to be a focus on the way students experience school. In a lot of ways, students don't see themselves reflected in curriculum. They don't feel engaged. And this was even before distance learning. So what we found that it's vitally important now to make sure that students are engaged and have energy and joy around going to school. And that can be done by making sure that curriculum is culturally responsive and speaks to the experiences that students know, and so that they can relate to what they're learning. And we also see a huge need for tending to the mental health needs of students. And this has galvanized leaders both in social services and in education to do more to work together to identify and meet students' social, emotional, and mental health needs. So I think it's a combination of implementing all of those pieces that have always been needed well before COVID, and making sure that students feel those changes as they come back to school. And these are the ways in which we shift and transform systems. This is an approach, a student-centered approach to providing education. It's starting with what student needs are and building out from there, rather than providing what we've always provided, and some students will hook into it and some students won't. So the hope is that this is going to be a catalyst for shifting people's mindsets and perspectives around providing education to students.
So that's an excellent opening for two questions. One is whether there's any teacher training in racial bias awareness in schools these days. The connected question is the curricular question that you've raised. If curriculum is changed or rewritten in some ways, maybe in extreme ways, maybe in subtle ways, to be more culturally sensitive or more racially sensitive, and I imagine that there's a lot of pushback against that. And I know that in articles that I've been reading, particularly about the school system in New York City, there has been very strong pushback against some of the curricular changes. Some of the language that is used in those changes seems to be extreme. And I know you have some experience at Education Trust West with the math curriculum. So I'm wondering about racial bias awareness for teachers and how curriculum can be created to address some of the cultural needs and racial needs without. What are the limits? What are the boundaries? How can it be best structured?
Yeah, that's a great question. To the first piece of your question around training around bias, I think that the focus on needing to address bias is gaining steam. I think that there is an ongoing and growing awareness that we all have bias. It's a function of the human brain, and how unfortunately that function of the human brain has resulted in disparate opportunities for folks. So I think that there we see investments in this in the California state education budget, which is really encouraging. But the devil is in the detail with these things. There's a lot of implicit bias training out there with varied impacts and effectiveness. So our hope is that when these trainings are implemented, they're done in really intentional ways that speak to experiences of teachers, but also don't shame teachers for what is, a natural cognitive function of the human brain. But it's also a function that we can challenge if we're motivated to make sure that we're creating justice and fairness for students. In terms of the question around curriculum, I think that this definitely has been a controversial issue that we have come across in the materials that we developed. It's called A Pathway to Equitable Math Instruction. And what this tool is a collection of strides or approaches to providing more inclusive approach to math instruction. We see math as a huge equity issue. There are the largest gaps when it comes to outcomes and opportunities when it comes to math and STEM accessibility generally. So we see this as a really high priority issue. Being math literate unlocks a lot of doors to opportunities, primarily in the state of California, where we have a huge industry around STEM and technology. If students can't access math, it is a gatekeeper from the myriad opportunities in technology fields in California. So it's a huge issue. One way that we have focused on addressing math instruction is to invite teachers to challenge biases that they might hold around math instruction. There's this idea that some people are not math people. And this in and of itself is sort of a biased approach to math. Everybody can learn math, and math can be engaging for everyone. And I think our focus on math instruction kind of is based in that. I have an FAQ that I can share from our Pathway to Equitable Math Instruction Toolkit that I'm just going to read a paragraph out of, because I feel like it illustrates really well what the approach is here. It says, when we think narrowly about teaching math, we create barriers for students. We allow them to fall into the trap of thinking they're not a math person. But the truth is, we all can be math people. The goal of a Pathway to Equitable Math Instruction is to engage as many students as possible in not just solving math problems, but understanding math concepts so they can apply them across a wide range of real-world applications. Math problems, of course, have correct answers, but students can arrive at a right answer without understanding the bigger concept, or they can have an aha moment when they see why they got an answer wrong. So this just shows what our approach is. It's about having an inclusive approach to math. It's not about excluding different groups from math instruction or shaming different groups. It's about widening the tent of students that are engaged and excited about math.
Thanks. Thanks for that explanation. It's very helpful. Here is a question on a slightly different topic, but our questioner asks whether you have any data about the educational opportunities and documented outcomes available to incarcerated youths or youths living in institutional settings. She asks, are race, class, and immigration status factors?
That's a great question, and I wish I had specific data on that. We are a part of a national organization, and our counterparts at the Education Trust in Washington, D.C. do a lot of work on justice-involved youth and access to educational opportunities. So I can reach out to them to see if they have those types of data and see if I can provide that to you, Levi, so you can pass it on. In terms of the second part of that question, there are a lot of factors associated with incarceration. I do know that there's disparate enforcement of laws based on communities that folks come from, whether folks are from communities of color, from undocumented communities, etc. But I don't have like the specifics that this question calls for, but I can work on finding those.
Great, thank you so much. No, here's a question that I don't quite know the context for, so I'll just present it the way it's written. Isn't there a quota for university acceptances?
I'm thinking that the context here is looking at affirmative action and how it is implemented in university admissions decisions. There actually are not quotas in the state of California when it comes to university admissions. Prop 209, well, let me back up. So the court case I mentioned from 1978, while it upheld taking race into account in admissions decisions, it struck down the use of quotas. So across the United States, quotas are unconstitutional when it comes to admissions decisions. However, race can be taken into account nationwide in college admissions decisions. But in California, because of Proposition 209 that passed in 1995, in California, we cannot take race into account at all in university decisions.
Okay, and the last questions really, or before this last question, I do want to point out to members of the audience that Ms. Wheatfall-Lum has put into the chat a link to the math curriculum frequently asked questions. So if you're interested in learning more about that particular math curriculum and what it recommends and its guidance, please check the link, and hopefully you'll get more information about it. So the last questions really are, what can we do? What recommendations do you have for regular people like me, us in the community? What can we do to improve equity, to address some of these issues? And a particular question being asked is from a really wonderful retired math teacher asking how can she help?
I'm sorry. I like to say I love these questions because this tells me that folks care about fairness and justice and want to get involved. That's great. There's a number of things folks can do that range from working with community-based organizations as a mentor or a college-going coach. There's lots of these organizations in the Bay Area in particular. There is Mission Graduates that supports youth in the Mission in San Francisco. There's College Track that has locations all over the Bay Area and the state. There is 10,000 Degrees that operates in Marin County that does support for students for college going. So there's lots of ways for folks to get involved directly with students. In terms of these systemic issues, as an individual, there's many ways that you can have influence on these decisions. It can come to getting informed on ballot measures when they come along on our ballots every 2 years, and seeing which of these measures, like I mentioned, Props 15 and 16 from 2020, like which of those ballot measures will increase equity and fairness, and doing what you can to support that, whether it's canvassing, donating money to campaigns, etc. So that's one way to get involved. Another is to get engaged in local elections, statewide elections, looking at your school board members and the elections of school board members, making sure that they're equity-minded leaders. They're the ones who choose our superintendents, and they can have influence over making sure we have equity-minded superintendents. We can focus on the elections of our state representatives in the Assembly and the Senate, making sure those leaders are social justice-minded leaders who center the needs of the most marginalized in their approaches to making policy. We also, which is unique for California, we elect the state superintendent of public instruction who oversees K through 12 education. So ensuring that the leader elected to that position centers equity in their work. So there's a number of ways that as a citizen, you can be active in just our political processes to make sure that the folks that are making decisions on our behalf are doing so in a way that centers the most marginalized folks.
Great, thank you. And I'll just point out that one of our audience members is sending a note about a 4-part documentary on Netflix, College Behind Bars by Ken Burns, which is highly recommended and asks a whole variety of important questions, including who has access to educational opportunities. So this is also recommended. Natalie, we are so grateful to you. I am so grateful to you. Our community is grateful to you for spending this time with us this evening, and for opening us up to the issues in education in our state, in our community, as well as guiding us in terms of a deeper understanding and giving us a sense of what we may be able to do about it. We are really, truly, truly grateful. And friends, thank you so much for being together with us this evening. As I mentioned earlier, this session has been recorded and it will be up on the PJCC website, pjcc.org. It will probably be available and live on the website by early next week. We look forward to having many other opportunities in the near future to come together, to learn together about a whole variety of things. So keep looking at the community calendar and the PJCC calendar and your synagogue's calendar to see what important and interesting things are taking place in the community that may be of interest to you. So I want to wish everyone a wonderful evening, a good night, and have a very lovely weekend. Natalie, again, many, many thanks.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.